you record that?
Yes, I just started now. So let me first share my whole screen so that I can just show you what is the main lab today. Okay, good. So okay, so today you guys went through the access control, various types of access control, right? So today's lab is a kind of a basic lab in terms of controlling the access on files and directories that you have on the operating system. So there are different types of access controls that you might have studied. So there is rule-based, there is role-based, there is mandatory access control, there's discretionary access control, and all those. So without going into the theoretical details, because you have already covered them. So remember that anything that is have on the operating system also requires this access control and these permissions. So for example, it's quite logical that there might be more than one people who are using a certain operating system, and you might have seen it in the labs in your schools or in the colleges, universities, where you will see that the same operating system is being used by multiple users. So they log in with their credentials and then they start accessing your system, the same system. Well, the scenario in that case is a little bit different because the permissions and all these usually is being managed by a centralized server. But even at your home, for example, you may have a situation in which your machine or your laptop is being used, or the same operating system is being used by maybe your siblings, So for example, if I have a laptop and then my brother, younger brother or sister, they might also have the access to my laptop in the same operating system. But in that case, I don't want, for example, that all of them, they have access to all my files and so on. So I may create more than one users, and each users will have their own work environment, and then they will have limited access to the files that belong to you, or to them, for example. So what I'm trying to say here basically is that at the operating system level, you can set the permissions to the files and the directories, and then you can like give them the type of access you want. So maybe in certain situation, there might be a file that you want to share with all the users. There might be a certain file that you don't want them to, let's say, write or modify it, but they can read it. So all these access controls, they can be implemented within the operating system. So similarly, in Linux, for example, we can apply these ACLs on these objects or in these files. And then once we set them, the operating system will control it. So whenever somebody is trying to access the operating system, we'll check what are the permissions on that, on a certain object or a file or a directory. And then based on that permission, the operating system will either allow or deny a certain user who is trying to access a certain file or a directory. So this lab is quite simple and easy. It's not that difficult to complete. So that is why we have two labs today. So one is the one that you will upload it on the platform, which is this one, related to Linux. And then we have an optional lab on the Windows, which again deals with the permissions, much more easier and graphical based, permissions you can give them. So today we are going to look at the file permissions and directories using the command line. So as you can see in this whole lab, you have to do certain steps. I'm not going to repeat the exact same steps, like, doesn't make sense that I demonstrate all these creating directories. But I will cover all the topics which are there, like how to create directory, how to create a file inside a directory, how to change the permissions on the file. So I'm going to show that, creating my own files, but then you will follow the steps which are given here. So for example, here it says that make a directory dir1 using mkdir. So I will create the same, I will use the same command mkdir, but I will just create a different directory. And then it says that you need to give the read permissions to the users and groups. So you will use this command chmod 444 dir1. So I will tell you here what does this 444 means, and what kind of permissions are being given to this directory, for example. Right. So you will basically follow these steps. Once I tell you how to do it, it will be easy for you. So at the end of the submission, what you need to do is that you have to record each step. When I say record means like you will take the snapshots of these steps that you have created the directories, and then you have to check the permissions on each file that you created in each directory by using the getfacl command, which basically will show you what are the permissions on a certain file or a directory. When I say directory, it basically means folder. In Windows, we call it folder. In Linux, we call it directory. Okay, so this is a lab about file permissions. So let me go through the demonstration, and then if you guys have any questions, you can always ask. So okay, let's zoom it a little bit. So for example, in the lab, it says that you need to first create a directory. So, you know, you can either go on the desktop, for example, and right click, or go to the folder wherever you want to create a directory, and you can go through the GUI as well. Like in Windows, you right click and make new folder. So the GUI option is also available in Linux, but we are just going to go through the command line. So for example, right now I'm in the root directory. Okay, so if I want to move to the desktop, I will just move to the desktop. And here I'm going to create a folder or a directory. So let me just minimize it a little bit so that you can see. Okay, so I want to create a directory or a folder called so mkdir is the command. So I'm going to create a folder called coding dojo, for instance. So as soon as I press this command, the folder or the directory is created. You can see it here, right? So now if I want to check it using ls, I can see that there is the coding dojo folder. So you guys know very well that if I want to move inside this folder, I just need to write cd and then the folder or directory name, and now I'm inside the coding dojo folder, right? So if I press ls, there is nothing inside it, so it's an empty folder. Within this folder or directory, I can create another folder. So for example, I can create mkdir. Let's just say, whatever. What should I call it? Dojo, no, cyber, for example. So I have created another directory or another folder within the coding dojo folder, right? I can also create the, the files by using touch commands. So for example, if I want to create a text file, let's say file1 dot txt. So touch can be used to create an empty file. If I press ls, now you can see that within the coding dojo folder, I have a folder called cyber, and then I have another file called file1.txt. So similarly, you can create multiple files as well. I can create 2, 3 files with the same touch command. I can write file1, file2, file3. So it will create like 3, 4 files, but it's an empty file. So the idea here is not like, we are trying to do something in the file, but we just want to see how we can give or assign permissions to these folders and these files. So for example, I want to check right now what are the permissions on this file, for instance, and who is the owner, and to whom does it belong. So you can write get FACL and then file 1.txt. So you can see here that this is the file. Who is the owner? The owner is the root. It now what group does it belong to? It belongs to the root. So it's quite logical and understandable because I'm logged in as a root user. So whoever is the user who creates the file, he is the owner. And by default, um, the same user belongs to his own group as well, which is root, unless or until you go on and change it to some other group. Like in Windows, you might have seen that there is an administrator group. So if you put all 4 or 5 users to the administrator group, they become a member of those groups. So anything or any permissions that you apply on a file to a certain group, all the users will have access to them, right? So anyways, it's not part of the lab today that, how to change the group, but I will tell you guys if you're interested that how you can change the groups. Now here, what you see is that there are 3 things. That what are the permissions to uh, to the user itself, the owner? What are the permissions to the group, and what are the permissions to others? So by default, you can see that the owner has a read-write permissions. The group to which this file belongs has a read permission only. And then for others, it is also read. The same thing, I can also see it by using ls-l, for instance, for file 1.txt. Now, here also you can see the same information in a different way, but a little bit more details are there, like the timestamp is there, for example, what time the file was created, for instance. So now I will start from left to right, and I will tell you how to read this information. So the first dash that you see here, now let me just write ls-l so that you can get the, it's not there on the platform, but ls-l, but I'm telling you, it's very useful to get more detailed information about the certain files and directories. Now, I just wrote ls-l, so whatever was inside this folder, I got the information about those files and directories. Now, I will first look at the first line, which is basically telling you the permissions and the information about the directory. And the second line is giving you information about the file. So if you look at the directory, so remember the first thing, it identifies whether it's a directory or a file. So the first D that you see here, it tells you that this is a directory, it's a folder. But if it's a hyphen sign or a dash sign, it basically means it's a file. So whenever you see that it's dash, the first dash, it means it is a file. If it is a D, it means it is a directory. Now, the next 3 things, which is read, write, and execute, is basically telling you that the owner of this file has read, write, and execute permissions on the directory cyber. And then for the file, which is file1.txt, the same owner, who is basically the root, has read and write permissions only. He doesn't have the execute permissions. The same thing you saw when I executed the get FACL command, because I was only doing it on the file1.txt. So you can see here that he has the read and write permissions only on the file. So here as well, by default, the operating system gives the owner read and write permissions, not the execute permission. So I will tell you, it's obviously it's for the security reasons, but it doesn't mean that you cannot change it. You can always change it to the execute as well, right? So so the first 3 for the directory is read, write, execute. For the file, it is only read and write. The next 3, which is these 3, so read, and then there is nothing, and then there is execute. So for the group to which it belongs has read and execute permission, but doesn't have write permissions. For the file, you can see that it has only read permissions, no write, no execute. And then for rest of the world, which means others apart from the owner and apart from the group, it has the read and execute permission on the directory, but it has only read permissions here. Here, the first one represents the owner, and this represents the group, owner and group. And then there is a timestamp when the file was created, probably. Yeah. And then I think this is the size of the file as well. So for instance, if I just open the file, what was it? File1.txt. And if I type something, okay. So I think the file size will change. Yeah, so you can see here, this basically represents the file size, I think in bytes. So, so this is for file 1, and this is for the directory, which is 4096. Okay. Is this clear so far? So I have only told you two things till now. I just told you that you can use mkdir to create a folder or a directory. You can use touch to create a file, you know, and then I showed you two commands, which is get FACL to find the permissions on the file. So in this case, I have written file1.txt. You can also get the for the directory as well, but you just have to write get FACL, and then it basically tells you that who is the owner, who is the group, what kind of permissions do they have. And the same thing I told you that you can use ls minus l. And then if I don't write anything, it will display the permissions of all the files. But in addition to the permissions, it also gives you information about the size of the file, when the file was created, and so on and so forth. All right, now let's move on towards the permissions, that how we can change the permissions. So let me just go back and refer to the platform. So they're using actually chmod to change the permissions. And then there are numbers like you can see here, 444. So let me just see. I want to show you. I know what basically this numbers mean, but it's better if I can just show you what does it read means, write, and execute. So we'll write it in the meantime here. So remember, read has a value of 4. Write has a value of 2, I guess. And execute has a value of 1. Now, what does it mean? It means if I want to change the file permissions that the owner and the group, they have only read permissions, I will make it just like on the platform, it says chmod, just a minute, chmod 444. It basically means give the read permissions to the owner who created the file, give the read permission to the group, and give the read permission to the others on this directory. This basically means that 4 means read. Okay, now let me just show you this one. So I have a file txt, and I showed you by using -l on file 1.txt that it has a read-write permission for the owner, it has a read permission for the group, and it has a read permission for others. Now, if I want to change all of them to read only, that no matter if somebody is the owner, no matter to which group does it belong, and no matter for others, I just want to change it to read only. So I'll use the command chmod 444, and then I will write file1.txt. Okay. Now, what happens with this is that I told you here that 4 is for read. So now when I write ls-l, I should be able to see R. Basically, it means that it has the read permission. So as you can see that the permissions on the files have been changed. So the owner, who is the root, has only read permissions. The group is the root, which has read permissions. And then for others, it is again read permission. Now, If I want to change it to write, what should I do? Anyone can tell me? If I want to change the permissions on this file
I
to,
write you.
yes, you will write chmod and 222.
Or two.
Yeah. If I want to change it to execute, I'm going to write it 111,
One.
for instance, right? And execute, by the way, it shows by X, okay? So let me just show you. So when you see X, it basically means that it has the execute permission. Now, it's not necessary that these numbers have to be same, okay? For example, I want the owner to have read, write, and execute permissions. But for the group, I only want, for example, read permissions. And for others, again, I just want read permissions. So what I'm going to do here is that if I want the owner to have read, write, and execute all of them, so you have exactly. So you have to add these numbers 4 plus 2 plus 1. So basically, I'm going to write
7.
yes. So I will change the 1 by 7. And then if I want the read permissions for the group, I will write 4. And if I want the execute permission, for example, let's just say execute for others, I will write 741. So now if I go back and check, you will see that the first owner has read, write, execute, and then the group has only read permissions, and then the others, they have the execute permission. Now it's all about numbers, okay? So you have to, and it's quite simple. If I want to give read and write permission, I have to give 6. If I want to give write and execute permissions, I have to write 2 plus 1, 3. So in this way, you can easily change the permissions on the files. The same thing applies for the directory as well, that if you're changing the directory permissions, you just have to replace this file name with the directory. So for example, I want to give read, write, and execute permissions to, for instance, the cyber directory. So I have simply went and changed it to 7.
Mr. Asad, what does execute do?
So execute, like some files or scripts, for example, you will see that if you download them, they are not executable. So you are not able to run them until you change the permissions on those. So from security perspective, Linux doesn't let, for example, the files to be executed unless you go and change them. Like in Windows, for instance, you download an executable, you double click, and it starts the execution of the file. And sometimes, it's dangerous if it's a malicious files, for example. And nowadays, by the way, I mean, the Windows have also included like an option when you double click, it asks you that, depending upon the UAC settings that, do you want to execute this file and so on. So in Linux, some files or scripts, you may have to change their permissions to execute them. Okay. You got it?
Yes, but if I had an execute only, how can I read or write? Like it just executes?
Yeah, it will just
I can't see anything.
You may not be able to view the contents of the file then.
Okay.
Actually, you are not who able to read the file. It's the system can do when execute the file.
No. For example, I got her question. She said that if you do not, because eventually the files are meant to be used by the users, right? I mean, this txt file, for example, what's the point that if I cannot read the file? So the permissions are for the users, whoever is trying to interact with the file, but the permissions or access control is controlled by the operating system. So once you tell the operating system that I don't want anyone to execute this file, I'll just go and change the permissions, and then the operating system, it's basically called a security label. So I don't want to go into the details of how operating system actually puts these files in. So, but let's just keep it simple, that it's just like I'm telling the operating system that I don't want anyone to execute this file. So when the next time somebody is trying to execute it, the operating system will check the security label of this file, and then it will restrict the execute. Okay. All right. So I think this is what you have to do. So you have to create directories. Inside directory, you have to create certain files and so on and so forth. I just want to tell one more thing, which is probably it's not in the lab, but I think it's relevant. That is, for instance, when I see that this file has, you know, let me see. So the owner of this file is root, for example. Okay, so how can you change the ownership of the file? Like, I created this file, but I want to make somebody else the owner of this file, so, or directory, so that he can manage it, for instance, and he can manage the permissions on this file. You know, it's like delegating the authority of giving permissions to the file and somebody else making him responsible. So if I see right now the root is the one who is the owner of this file, I can add a user, for example, and I can call it Raza, for instance, a new user I'm creating. So it's very simple in Linux. You just write add user and then just give any password. So I'm not going to fill all the details, but let's just say. So now I have created a new user called Raza, and I want to make this Raza the owner of this file, file1.txt. So how can you do that? It's very simple. Again, I'll just write change owner uh, to Raza, for example, and then the file name, which is file1.txt. Now, if I just go back and then check the permissions on the file, sorry, I want to show you only for the file. So ls-l file1.txt. You can see that it has the ownership of the file has changed. Now Raza is the owner of the file, and then but it still belongs to the root group as well. And again, you can also choose or change the group as well. It's very simple. I think it's change owner Raza, and then you have to give the group name. So let's say, because every user has a group as well in the Linux with his name, and then I can just write file1.txt. So I basically change the user and I change the group of this file1.txt. So if I go back and check, the ownership has changed, the group has been changed, and now Raza user can actually have access to the file, and he can do whatever he likes with the file. Like, he can give permissions on this file as well. Okay, guys. So I think from the Linux point of view, I think it's like more than what you need to do in the platform. So what you will do is that you will follow the instructions here, like I told you, and then show me the permissions of each of these directories and files that you have created in this previous step. You will upload this one, and then you will move on to the second lab, which is an optional lab in Windows. Now, Windows is quite simple and it's very easy. I mean, I will share with you the document that that I have for that lab, but I can show you exactly what you need to do. So the same idea of permissions is basically applied on Windows, but here in Windows, for example, I create a folder called cyber, for instance, and then how do you manage the permissions on this folder, for instance? So if I right click and go to the properties, and then you can see sharing and security. So if I go to the security, for instance, I'll click on the edit, and then I can add the users, and I can give them access. So for example, if I go to add, I'll have to look for the user here. So I have another user called Ali in my operating system. So I'm going to add him here, for example. And then what kind of permissions do I want to give him? Do I want to give him the full control, or do I want to give him the modify? Same things you can see, read and execute, list the folder contents, or you just want to give him a read permission. So I will just uncheck everything else, for example, and just leave read, apply the permissions, okay, and then click OK. So basically, Ali user basically has the permissions of read only on this folder. So sometimes on Windows, I'm not talking about the Active Directory environment and how the files are being shared there, but generally, now if I share this file with somebody, and sorry, if Ali logs into the same operating system, he will have access to this file, but only the read access to this file. All right, so they, again, for the Windows also, there are some instructions given, which you have to follow the same way, just like I showed it to you. If you want to share it on the network, then probably it's a little bit different. What happened to this file? If you want to share it on the network, so sharing is different thing. We are not going into the sharing thing right now, but I just told you that how you can add a different user and give him the types of rights. So if I click here, for example, the administrator, he has the full access of the file, right? But this user has only read access to the file. Okay, that is an optional lab, but again, it's maybe you may have to do certain steps more than I just demonstrated. Now I will show you where you need to submit the optional lab. So the optional lab, I have created a drive here, sorry, a folder called optional lab. So I'm going to share the link with this. Actually, I shared it in Discord. When you open it, you will see these organized by the date. So today is 2nd of October. So today's optional lab, you will have to upload it here. Just rename the file with your name and then upload it. Okay, guys. I think I'm done with the demonstration. If you guys have any questions, please go ahead, or otherwise you can start working. I will create the breakout rooms for you.